Yeah, I'm Yanina Welp. I'm more than happy, I said, to chair the first meeting in this series, Democracy Rebooted, Deliberative Responses to Planetary Challenges. These series are hosted by the ECPR Standing Group on Democratic Innovations, the APSA Democratic Innovations Related Group, la Red de Politólogas, the PSA Participatory and Deliberative Democracy Group. And today, this conversation is also included in the program of the Geneva Democracy Week, co-organized by the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. These virtual seminars are designed to critically question the role of democratic innovations in responding to planetary challenges, like growing autocratization, the current racial contract, the ecological crisis, and the exclusion of non-human animals from decision-making spaces. There are many people pushing to deal with these controversial and highly relevant issues and making possible this quite global conversation. My thanks to all of them, and particularly to Azucena Moran for spreading her enthusiasm and leading this activity. In the first conversation, we will focus on participatory deliberative authoritarianism. This is challenging because
o deliberativo. Y es un tema
false of democratic representation. Deliberation, as a particular form of participation, is expected to improve governance and trust. And other forms of participation, such as referendums, are expected to provide accountability and eventually open the agenda to new demands. But what happens when we move to authoritarian or hybrid regimes? Can we just assume that participatory processes are a smokescreen with no meaning? Or it could be that in some circumstances it plays a role providing legitimacy and helping regime survival. To talk about this, we will take into special consideration the recent Chinese and Latin American experiences and other Asian experiences, considering the cases also in Latin America, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. Our two invited speakers have reflected on common questions to help us to make a clearer picture of what is at stake. We have María Isabel Puerta Riera and Su Jung Wu. María Isabel is Adjunct Professor at Valencia College, an Associate Researcher at GAPAC, and member of the Red de Politólogas. Her research focuses on democratic backsliding and authoritarianism in Latin America, in particular Venezuela's transition to participatory democracy and its current institutional crisis. Su is postdoctoral researcher at the University of Zurich and an advisor at the Social Equity and Participation Center in Chengdu. Her research focuses on the use of public deliberation in China and the emergence of democratic innovations in authoritarian settings. The dynamic we agree on is that they have some questions, they will exchange their ideas on these questions and ask the other. And doing that, we expect to have like a picture coming from quite different places of the world to deal with the main question on participatory authoritarianism, the understanding of that, and the effects. So I very much welcome you, and I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Yanina. I'm very happy to be here and excited to be discussing this with all of you. So let me just start off with the first question that has been on my mind, which is about what are the current challenges and interesting issues that we encounter in our research on authoritarian deliberation and participation. Personally, for me, I find that something that maybe not a lot of people would know is Chinese deliberation and participation is actually a lot more varied than one would expect. And it's very difficult to always cast it in a very one-dimensional view that it is merely democratic window dressing or is instrumental. I think that because I focus a lot more on the local level, and I had the chance to do some ethnographic / field work by visiting and observing some of these deliberative processes, the sense of democratic consciousness, even though the Chinese participants might not see it as such, is rather high. For example, if you ask them whether they would like to stop having this form of participation, they would get actually quite upset because they see the benefits of this participation. By the way, I'm talking about participatory budgeting, which is the focus of my research for my PhD. So that's the very interesting sort of democratic experiment that we see in an authoritarian system. And I think it's very interesting that Yanina talked about using democratic innovations and deliberative participation as a way to enhance governance, trust, transparency, and accountability. And I would argue that to a certain extent, these are also the goals of the Chinese authoritarian government when it comes to allowing spaces for deliberative participation. But of course, we need to give ourselves a bit of a reality check for China. Ultimately, the goal is to make sure that the party stays responsive so that it can always be, its rule can be strong, that it will not be sort of threatened by social instability where people are angry or unhappy because their needs and inputs are not taken into consideration. So those are some of the more interesting issues that I can share. Maybe allow me to share one challenge that I fear right now in light of the current political environment before I pass the mic over to Maria. So I think we all know that in China, with the current president, the political mood has been rather difficult. And I think by and large, the idea that the space for civil society is shrinking will also affect the space for deliberative participation to take place. That's because one case that I focus on, which is participatory budgeting in Chengdu, I work quite closely with the NGO who is responsible for sort of driving the deliberative participation. And personally, I've heard recent developments that are not very optimistic. So that's kind of the current challenge that I face in my research, of course, given the zero COVID policy and lack of access to China, which also prevented me from doing further fieldwork. So these are just some thoughts and sharing to start us off. I'll be happy to hear from Maria about her experiences.
Sure, thank you. Also thank you to Yanina and Azucena. You have been amazing at organizing, and I'm thrilled to be here sharing our experiences with everyone. So I have been working on participatory democracy since Chavez came to power. So participation has been branded as a tool, not only for democracies or an aspiration for democracies. It has been the core issue of these social movements that have pursued equity, inclusion, and of course, social justice. But this has not been exclusive to these social movements. We've seen many authoritarian or even hybrid regimes use this as a tool to diffuse opposition's challenges, or just like Yanina has written about, and others like Armando Chaguacera. These are tools to search for legitimacy or give the appearance of it, not only in a domestic form, but abroad. So this is the perception that we have. But looking into what we have done so far, as Yanina mentioned, I'm a researcher at GAPAC, and we're working on these issues, the Cuban case, the Venezuelan case, and the Chinese case too. But beyond what it means to seek for popular support under these authoritarian regimes, what we see is that there has been a challenge at the theoretical level. And that has been my works ever since I started in Venezuela. There's this challenge that democracy is flawed because of representation, is not enough. So we have to move forward with participation, because this is what really is going to bring people into being the center of democracy. When in fact, this false debate, this is out of question. Democracy, representative democracy or liberal democracy, is not colliding with the idea of participation. But participationism is a way to take the focus of not just representation, but democracy itself. So I guess in my research, what I've found is that there's this need to displace or replace representation. So through participation, you can basically subject decision-making processes all the way up to power. I would say that's one of my main findings. So I'll jump into the second question first, Sue. So I was thinking about the Latin American experience, and I wonder if clientelism and neo-patrimonialism are shaping the forms of participation and deliberation under authoritarian regimes. Because in the case of Cuba, maybe you'll find that those expressions are less because it's a closed authoritarian regime. But Venezuela, in that evolution from a democracy to a hybrid regime, and now not a closed authoritarian regime yet, but it's really loosening the constraints and the limits you have in democracies. So it plays a role, especially clientelism. It plays a role even at the level of local participation, especially these artifacts that the Constitution and successive laws of communal power and so on have given people. This is a salient issue. So I would like to hear from you, Sue, about this.
Thanks so much for the very interesting question. And I have to confess that when it comes to sort of contextualizing clientelism with participation in China, I can't really see a direct link, because usually clientelism is sort of linked to sort of the elite politics, and of course also what we call center-periphery relations, because China, although it's a authoritarian unitary state, there's actually quite a fair bit of decentralization going on. So usually I think when it comes to how they distribute or redistribute resources from sort of the center or to the from the high levels to the lower levels of government, these patron networks come into play and can also produce certain kind of dynamics. But maybe the one closest thing I can sort of think of, which comes from my fieldwork when I was in Chengdu, which is a southwestern part of China, the city, the capital city. The one thing that my sort of contact, this NGO in Chengdu, was sharing with me is that there's an importance of cultivating good relationship. In Chinese culture, there's this idea of guanxi, which is relationship, that permeates, I think, all aspects of society and even politics. You'll find that even among the Chinese leadership, there's a lot of these relationship and factional ties going on. So in a way, it is very resonant, but how does it translate into affecting participation and deliberation? I would say, of course, in an indirect way, people who have good relationship with the authorities will get to negotiate for more space for participation to happen, because it's not a democratic system. So it's not, we cannot take for granted that participation will always be allowed. So I have seen sort of NGOs who have tirelessly tried to, like I say, build up a very good relationship, build up a good rapport with local authorities in order to sort of run some pretty amazing experiments. Maybe just one last thing is, one of my close collaborator, or rather the NGO I'm sort of also working for, they tried to innovate by bringing participatory budgeting onto social media, because they think that with this digital turn in participation, and also because China right now is focusing a lot on digital use, albeit for more pernicious purpose, I know, in the broader context, but for the societal actors like NGOs, some of them are trying to see if they can enhance and increase citizen participation by bringing it to social media so that more people will be able to use it, because offline participation requires like a lot of time that a lot of people might not have. So why not try to explore replicating the steps of participatory budgeting onto, you know, this platform? And even then, it also requires the sign-in and the approval of course, local authorities, which is why the relationship really matters. So I think that's probably the sharing and the experience that I have from China. And I'm just wondering, Maria, would you have further sharing to add on by contrasting it with the Latin American experience, or should I move on to the next question?
Yes.
Okay, so I think one of the interesting things that inspired the next question is I've been participating in some discussion that talks about decolonizing democratic studies and also including non-Western perspectives. And I personally find it very exciting. Of course, it's rather controversial because I often get mistaken for sort of representing an authoritarian view. I want to sort of have a preface out there that I'm not justifying or condoning the non-democratic atrocities, but I do think that we should have this conversation about what impact does the phenomenon of authoritarian participation and deliberation have on the field of democratic studies? Can it sort of compel us to think beyond this sort of current framework that we have, which is very much rooted in the Western liberal sort of centric idea of democracy, right? But of course, we understand that there are ramifications and implications if we start to include sort of the authoritarian voices. But I feel that there is something that we could sort of learn, or at least try to establish as a kind of commonality. So I feel like at least my experience from looking at participation in China, and given how there is a very pragmatic political logic behind allowing for sort of participation and deliberation to take place, is the emphasis on democratic governance, even if ultimately they're not concerned about systemic democratization or a democratic government. So I see the commonality then between authoritarian and non-authoritarian systems, because I think everybody wants to have democratic governance to ensure that there is responsiveness, to preempt sort of people's unhappiness and grievances by giving them, you know, sort of channels for inputs. So I'm just curious sort of to hear from you about this.
I think the impact varies depending on the case, because we tend to kind of box, you know, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, okay, this is a box. And then we have Chile and Colombia, and this is another box. But when you go into the realities of each of these systems and societies and the culture, because I think you've mentioned that in the Chinese case, we can't leave culture outside of the conversation when it comes to Latin America, because I think it's kind of a mistake. I guess it's a mistake. It's not intentional. We tend to think of Latin America as a unique expression in terms of policy, and the interests are not necessarily the same. They're not aligned. So I think the impact varies, but not just because of these particular aspects or the very specifics of each case. I think we have to look at these realities are forcing us to broaden, to expand the categories. And that's a problem itself, because then we're going to have a lot of labels for each case. And I think that's a problem. But the other is that these authoritarian expressions like Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, they are not exactly the same, and they're not operating on the same, say, they have commonalities, similarities, but they have also very different expressions. In Venezuela, there is a very strong party, but it's not the case of Cuba. And in Nicaragua, we have seen kind of more trending towards Cuba because of the basically banning the opposition parties. But it's not exactly the same. So each of these cases have a variation of authoritarianism, and that's something to consider, because in these regimes, the use and application of participation and its tools is very different. In Cuba, we've seen it with the referendum, right? It's been used in a way that it might divide people, the electorate, but it even has the power to divide further in issues all sides care. So just look at the impact it has in cases like Cuba. But in other aspects, I think we have seen how certain issues have been used for example, in the case of Venezuela, we have seen how in one occasion, a referendum was lost by Chavismo, but then 2 years later, they won on an issue that had little, let's say, arguments in favor. I mean, re-election for everyone was something that the opposition also embraced. So there we have, in that case, it was a hybrid regime, but an issue that was so divisive became a moment of maybe not overly, spoken out, but it was there, and that was one of the consequences. So it depends on how tough the regime is and how capable it is to control results. But what we see is that it is an instrumental use of participation. And that's what sometimes might make it easier for us on this side to fall prey of conceptual stretching, because, oh yes, this is an authoritarian regime, but they have democracy. Not necessarily authoritarian, probably like when we started talking about authoritarianism in Venezuela, it was a hybrid regime. It wasn't there yet, and we had a lot of debate about it. But then now, when we talk about Cuba and Venezuela calling for referendums or sham elections, is this participation, or should we call it in a different way? So I think the debate is being driven by, let's say, a consolidated theoretical framework that is being challenged by the experience. And this is what we have to avoid. The conceptual stretching is one of the problems that I see that are bothering us as a community in terms of what's happening specifically with participation and deliberation under authoritarian regimes. Okay, now let's go to the next question, which is very, I think it's very provocative for both of us, because it's about local deliberation. So let's see. So do you think local deliberation differs from other participatory formats, such as referenda or others like it? And to what extent and under what conditions could it open room to advance the agenda of rights and democratization? I have the recent experience of Cuba as a starting point of this conversation. You could talk about the Chinese experience, but when I see it from the Cuban experience recently, it has been such a divisive issue. And it has given the Cuban regime an opportunity. At first, there was no question that the referendum was going to go the way the Cuban government said it would. So there you have the first approach to it. But the second one that I think is the most concerning in terms of political costs for the opposition is that this issue was used to not only show the strength of the regime, it's going to be used, it's being used to further differences among not a frail opposition, it's the opposite. It's an opposition that has been growing and strengthening. And like Armando Chaguasara said in one piece I read, this is going to fracture a movement that was advancing in many ways since July 11th of last year. So what happens when you have this scenario and you think using these tools, in case of Chinese local, the local participatory experience, how does it work there? Do you think that has any effect on regime stability? What about the public opinion there? So.
Thanks very much, Maria. And I think it's very fascinating in your explanation. And there are many things that you have mentioned, which I have trouble sort of reconciling with the Chinese case, but that's also the very fascinating and interesting part. Things like referendum doesn't exist. And opposition parties also doesn't exist, because technically there are 8 other political parties in China, but under the guidance and advice of the Chinese Communist Party. So it's a what they call multi-party cooperation, but not multi-party competition. So there's a very interesting, sort of very authoritarian, one party dominant sort of setup. Does deliberation and deliberative participation differ from then other types of participatory practices? I think it's interesting that there are actually there's quite a variety of participatory practices in China at a very, very local level. There used to be, and I think it's still running, village elections where the villagers could directly elect a local village council that looks into the day-to-day running of village affairs. In the past, when I think especially in the 80s to 90s, they were considered to be fairly free and fair. They in fact also had American observers who came in to observe and decided that, for China, it's actually pretty amazing that they have been quite free and fair. Having said that, village elections today are not exactly very meaningful anymore. First of all, villages have been hollowing out because of the whole rural to urban migration. And then interestingly, the Chinese government itself is trying to focus and emphasize a lot more on deliberative democracy and deliberative participation. So in that regard, you have public hearings as well. And also, it's important to point out that in the Chinese translation, deliberation is loosely translates more into consultation. And consultation has that historical root in China. So a lot of these current deliberative participatory practices sort of have some philosophical underpinnings in Chinese history and philosophy. So a very good example is the participatory budgeting and deliberative poll. They actually did a combination in Zhejiang province, Wenling, this city. That's one of the, I think, most famous cases of participatory budgeting in China. And there, they actually had a precursor, which was a very organic local form of deliberation or consultation, because I know deliberation has more stringent criteria in the academic sense. So I often also face criticisms about how is that deliberation is just, talk. So I think there's a difference. There is also a certain acceptance and desire by the regime to now use and consider the deliberative participation as part of this, what it calls whole process democracy. So I think, I'm not sure how many people know, but last year in December, the Chinese government actually issued a white paper on democracy with a title that says, China, Democracy That Works. So there is already a very direct, I think, criticism of the Western democracy that doesn't work. Now China is trying to say that we have a democracy that works because we have consultation, we have participatory practices, right? So I think in that case, sort of linking to the question of what are the prospects then for democratization? If it's democratization in the sense that we understand, it seems that prospects are rather dim because now the Chinese regime has taken over, has appropriated this democratization and the talk about democracy, has offered its version of democracy. And then they can even say that, but we have practices to support the idea that we have democratic consultation, we have democratic practices. So this is a very interesting, I think, development. It's not always easy to get around, but I do want to hold the hope that maybe in the long term, we are setting a foundation for potential democratization, because we tend to focus so much on, once again, the introduction of free and fair elections, especially at the higher level, as a sign of a democracy. But if we disaggregate it and go back to the heart of what democracy means, which is citizen participation, actually there are still spaces of possibilities for Chinese people to participate. Right now, it's very much confined to the local level, but it still allows them to undergo some kind of, I would say, democratic education. But this, of course, stands with a very uneasy coexistence between democratic experiments and practices, and also a very broad, undemocratic political system in China. Yeah.
Thank you, Sue and María Isabel. Very, very interesting points here. I have more than conclusions. In fact, it found all the things quite like challenging and provocative, and I have some reflections and questions for you, and also for the audience if they want to write the questions. Also, I mean, we open the space for that. My first reflection relates to the level of government, local, national. I think it's quite interesting that, because following what you say, so it looks like in China, these work at quite different levels. And I wonder if I understood it correctly or not. And I'm thinking that in Latin America, we have all a new wave of studies of subnational politics, stressing that to study the subnational level helps to understand better the national level too. I mean, the democracies in some Latin American countries were working better on top than in the subnational level, or there are much more diversity, etc., etc. And I wonder if we take China as a case, the picture for me looks kind of contradictory. And I don't know if I'm catching it in a good way. Second point related to that, comparing your comments on the different regions, it looks like in China, local participation is working to help the party and the government to stay responsive. So to somehow, it sounds like a good outcome. And then I wonder why the president is now stopping and reducing these spaces. I mean, there is a danger or a perceived danger on the democratizing effect of these local spaces, or there are just very narrow spaces at the local level, where I think in general, the working of participatory budgeting in Latin America shows that it could help to somehow, and under X conditions, not everywhere, to improve governance. But it's not really challenging politics, even not at the national and the local level. Do you know what I mean? I mean, political parties, the government, the second level and the third level are like keep safe when participatory budgeting is working. So I wonder again, what is this relation between the local and the national in China? And on the opposite, my perception is that in the cases María Isabel took, the participatory institutions at the local level are not really providing an improvement on you said legitimacy, but as an instrumental legitimacy, not improving governance. So it's more a clientelistic pattern than a way to improve governance. And as far as I know, and now things are going worse and worse in Venezuela, but some years ago, in Chavez's period, in the period in which the country was in autocratizing, this, for instance, communal councils produces a lot of corruption, inefficiency, overlapping between different projects, etc., etc. So we're not improving governance at all. And this is a kind of surprising, challenging reflection, because we see that in a closed autocracy, it seems that this is working better. I wonder if this is the case. And then going to the decolonizing aspect, you spoke about democratic governance, and I wonder if we really can talk about democratic governance or just the model of governance. Because according to what you said, as soon as this is a bit more plural and introduce a risk of challenging the autocracy, the process is closed. So it's not really a model of governance, democratic governance. It's a model of governance. Then, yeah, my final is a bit, I'm reflecting, and I need to reflect more on that. We choose the concept of participatory deliberative authoritarianism, and I wonder which kind of definition, if any, we could provide for that, because we are also talking a lot about participatory democracy, and at the end of the day, in the different definitions, I think probably the mainstream is the one referring to institutions addressed to increase political participation of the citizens. And then, yeah, political participation has many different meanings too. So can we really talk about authoritarian, participatory authoritarianism, defining a closed concept? Because we have closed autocracy now in the discussion, and other cases, which Venezuela now is also clearly an autocracy, but a few years ago was not, and was in process of autocratizing, and we saw how these instruments were part of the process of autocratizing, particularly to take power from the departments, the local level, and directly address the people from the presidency. So I don't know which kind of reflections do you have on the concept. And then finally and quickly, I was also thinking in a research I did with Francisco Soto on deliberative constitution making a few years ago, and we analyzed 27 cases, national level, cases in which the constitution was replaced. We didn't care about the definition of the type of regime, so we included autocracies, countries in transitions, post-conflict, post-civil wars, and also democratic settings, and we analyzed the process of deliberation. We took deliberative process, not referendum, but instances addressed to discuss and provide inputs for the constitution making. And then we analyzed how this information was systematized. And we found that in all the cases, the process of communication, there were some variation, but was not really related to the type of regime. And then on the side of systematizing what the governments did with the content, we found that in general, there was not such a radical difference between the different regimes. So in more autocratic, yes, like Cuba, for instance, in the 1976, they opened, and in 2019 again, a huge process of deliberation in the country, which I think the 2019 was even more plural than the previous one, which was much more addressed to the party. So it was quite plural, quite open. There was a lot of deliberation, massive participation, but the point is with what happens after. And what happens after in Cuba was a kind of black box. A small group of appointed people selected what mattered from this massive process of deliberation. But the interesting point is that some other process, even what process which doesn't fit in the definition for our research with Soto, but we can take in Europe recently with the citizens' assemblies, share some similarities on this idea of cherry picking, let's say, governments or a commission taking only what really fits in the agenda of the government. So again, I'm being provocative. I mean, I know there are clear differences between democratic system and authoritarian settings, but what I see is that to look at authoritarian settings also help us to identify some of the weaknesses of this deliberative process in democratic settings. And of course, this is a very general comment because we can go case by case, and we have very interesting cases which skip this pattern in democracies. But we find others in which it's not the case. And particularly with these national dialogues in some Latin American countries, which are clearly democratic, but also is a kind of black box what they do with these processes of deliberation. So yeah, whoever wants to take the...
you maybe go first.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I have captured every question, so I'll just try my best. I think the first you asked about the difference in the participation between the local and the national level. Did I get it correct? So at the national level, you have deliberation, but I would say it's either superficial deliberation or very elite-based deliberation. So actually, China has created, the Chinese government has created, they have an institution which has a Chinese People Political Consultative Conference. So it's supposed to sort of contain a variety of different voices from society, from all walks of life, to give input on policy issues. But it's mostly about collecting opinion rather than having, I would say, consequentiality or to have a translation into actual policy outcome. Maybe for some of the more softer, non-sensible issues, sensitive issues, it's possible. Local citizen participation and deliberation has been a lot more.
Just to jump on a question related to what you said. But you said it's collecting opinions, but then there is a kind of public answer to these opinions. Is affecting policy making, you said not much or is unclear, but is a kind of transparency or reaction on that or nothing?
In my understanding, nothing. Is mainly just this, for this particular institution is mainly as a show. And the Chinese government will always say that we have a deliberative body that is embedded within our political structure. And this is the deliberative body. But if you look at it, it's very, very elitist. The people are not, they are like pre-selected. So you can imagine the kind of views that they are allowed to, that they will be expressing would not be something too controversial. Whereas at the local level, you get, I would say, more meaningful participation, where in the Zhejiang case, which is the East Coast, which is the best practice or golden standards of deliberation, they actually use random selection to pick the participants to also try to ensure more equality. And there, I think I have observed the actual deliberative process, and people are actually quite active in even questioning the authorities about why did they cut certain spending item as compared to last year, So it seems that there is a fair bit of also demanding the accountability and response from the local officials. So I would say superficially that's what I would say. So at the local level, a lot more of these participatory experiments were allow and introduce, because at the local level is where you have a lot more of the social conflicts and also conflicts over interests. And therefore the authorities, they feel that, okay, we need to allow what they call a valve for the people to be able to express their discontent. And in even like the very local level, the villages, I have come across or heard from actual personnel involved in the deliberation that they're used as a way of mediating social conflict. So I think at the local level, you'll find a lot more of these instances of meaningful and consequential deliberation, whereas at the national level, I would say it's more about putting up the appearance of having deliberation, but the actual outcome is, I would say, probably not that significant. So I think maybe I'll allow Maria to respond to others, and then I'll come back again to respond to the other questions.
So I want to piggyback on what you just said, because I think that sets the contrast with what I've seen from my experience, especially in Venezuela. You have these local spaces, the communal councils and all the instances of participatory deliberation that came after the Constitution. So it was just the development of what initially was promoted as a participatory democracy. Okay, so these spaces of local decision-making, they took shape from a top-down process. It wasn't born down in the communities. It was brought by the central government. So the problem that I see here, and this is what Yanina was asking about, the instrumental nature of these spaces of decision, is I think they do bring some sense of legitimacy, at least from their perspective. The government, the central government. Okay, we are giving people have the opportunity to participate, but this is not governance. Why? For example, in these communal councils, people would address their problems with basic utilities, which have been a problem for Venezuela, especially in the provinces. Okay, no water, electricity fails, and so on. So, you know, streets and schools and so on. So they might deliberate and they might come to some agreements. They might have the diagnostics, they might have the solution, but the problem is who has the resources? And the resources are way high up in the scale of public administration. These communal councils have the money for other needs. And like Yanina said, we have a lot of corruption in as a backdrop for this. So you might have the intention to address these problems, but the budgets, these communal councils, at least from my own field work, that was never enough to address the real needs. We're talking about infrastructure. That's not enough. What we found from the reports of the government is that these communal councils would probably give people some access to goods and services that were not enough to close that gap between what they need as a community and what they have access to. So that's one thing, resources. But what I do think is that these spaces are excellent. If we're going to conceptualize them, these are excellent for diffusing threats against the government. Like you said, Sue, we're gonna let people decide at the lower level, whatever they want to decide, but that is not going to translate into policies. Yanina, trying to respond to your question, this is not participation. This is barely consultation. That's not going to be binding in any case. They are giving the people the opportunity to to experience what would be participation, but this is not tied to decision making. The decision making is at the elite level. So I think if that helps, this is absolutely instrumental, but what we have seen so far is that it has nothing to do, it has no impact on the decision-making process, and therefore it doesn't solve people's problems.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe, Sue, if you want to take the second question, or I don't know the order now, regarding democratic governance, because I think this was also is something controversial. I would like to listen. What do you think?
Okay, so I think, of course, it's very difficult to get around it by saying democratic governance, but having a very authoritarian, non-democratic government as the backdrop. So I know it's not easy to reconcile that. But I think if you look at some of the, if you just break it down in a very disaggregated manner to look at what does democratic governance actually entail, right? Certain things like responsiveness and also the ability of people to provide their input, that's still a people-centric sort of focus. I think to a certain extent, at the local level, but when it comes to participatory budgeting, and also going back to Maria's point, I think maybe I didn't clarify. At the national level, I think the recommendations do not get translated, but actually at the local level for participatory budgeting, the people's votes and the decision actually do get to be discussed and eventually can be translated into policy outcome. And it's also to the, that's because it's to the authorities' benefit as well to sort of implement projects, development projects in the locality that the people want, rather than guessing what the people want, which is the whole point of participatory budgeting. So I think at the local level, and this has been also shown and done in several studies, that it has actually generated a good outcome, and people are by and large pretty satisfied with that. They see that it has been, their voices have been heard and translated into concrete actions, which is why participation has sort of continued, and that process of participatory budgeting has been institutionalized. So, but back to the point about democratic governance, as I meant, maybe democratic governance might make people very uncomfortable. Maybe at the end of the day is responsive governance. I think that's something that the Chinese government has been quite well known for, and they also explain its ability to stay in power. This idea of authoritarian sort of resilience, because they are able to create input sort of institutions to allow people to participate in very selected control areas. And here, I think I want to really emphasize on the control, that I'm not in any way naive about the motivation and rationale behind the implementation of these participatory practices. Ultimately, the Chinese Communist Party will be controlling these processes, they are managing these processes, and in a very recent development, because of the current president's sort of focus and desire to ensure strong party sort of control and rule, these participatory processes have taken what I would call a party focus in a lot of the, because I'm not able to do field work now in China, but from the media reports, you can see how they frame participatory processes. While they are saying that people are happy and people think that participation and deliberation is the way to go to resolve local conflicts, and then they start to bring in how this also serves and sort of enhance the party vision. So you start to see a lot more of these inclusion of the party, which refers to the political, the Chinese Communist Party. So I would say, maybe going back to Yanina's point, that this whole idea of democratic governance right now is less and less resonant and less convincing, I would have to admit as well.
I don't know if it's worth to say, but what if there is an authoritarian governance? They develop the skills to use certain tools to not just keep them empowered, but to diffuse these threats against their regimes.
Sorry, I think this is a very interesting question. And in a way, I always think about if the ends justify the means, meaning yes, is to make sure that the regime stays in power. But what if you have somewhat positive outcomes where the people do feel that, okay, at least my opinions have been taken into consideration? And of course, in authoritarian regimes, such participation is in very, very restricted area. Like I would say participatory budgeting at the end of the day is still fairly non-sensitive. If you want to look at deliberation in like other topics like, I don't know, human rights, of course, this is inconceivable and would never be allowed. So I think authoritarian regimes are smart to allow and open up spaces of participation in selected areas, which can still help to increase the sense of legitimacy. At least the people are somewhat appeased and feel that my opinions are taken into consideration in some areas. And then authoritarian sort of participation or participatory authoritarianism or authoritarian governance might not necessarily be an entirely negative thing, or it's not always negative. I mean, of course, we need to be very mindful of where some of the dangers lie, but I think we shouldn't always look at it in such a one-dimensional and negative way. There could be some good unintended outcomes. So, I mean, I know this is very controversial, but this is something that I constantly have to ask myself. Is it always bad and negative, right?
Now we have a few minutes to arrive to the end. I think the topic will stay on the table and we will need to follow. But I want to, for these 3-4 minutes we have, to go back to my question on, it makes sense to talk about participatory authoritarianism and as something opposite to participatory democracy. And I wonder, because I think it's clear when we are in front of an authoritarian regime, but the models of participatory democracy are quite weak. So I wonder, it makes sense, the definition, or we should work more on what defines a model of participation and some conditions to classify different models and have more diversity between one extreme and the other. Of course, it's a difficult question, so I'm just asking for your impression, your quick impression on the point before ending.
And I think it's important, Yanina, that very observation you're making, because we are watching that the liberal influence, you know, it's not about ideology, it's about the methods. It's about the mechanisms. At GAPAC, we have a paper about the liberal influence of China in Latin America. And what we have found is that it doesn't matter if it's a right wing or left wing issue. That's not the issue. The issue is, how do I reach power and how do I keep power? And that's why all these categories sometimes are not useful, are not helpful for us to understand the process. It's not working because probably we're stuck with those definitions that we used to in political theory. But right now we have to kind of review, take a step back and look at the different map that we have right now, because it is very complex and it's not like how we used to frame the discussion about left or right. This is about probably democracy and illiberalism. And there's a combination. You have people on the left supporting Putin, and it doesn't make sense, but it does make sense when it comes to the instruments and the methods.
I really agree with Maria, and I think sometimes I ask myself, when the lines are already so blurred, does it make sense to be so fixated with sort of categorization? Of course, from an academic, intellectual point of view, it does make sense as a kind of analytical category. But maybe because I also work with the NGOs, so on the ground, I was like, do they care if it's participatory authoritarianism or participatory democracy? Probably not. Because on the ground, there are a lot more complexities and it defies categorization. I think a lot of the strategies that these societal actors are able to come up with to fight for some spaces of participation to contest power in very, very small, even indirect ways, I think is quite incredible, and sometimes really is very hard to put in the categorization. But as a kind of broader reflection for us to think about, I think it's also important to think about why we want to do that and for what purpose, and what are the implications that we have if we want to sort of define and refine the understanding of what participatory authoritarianism means. I mean, this is a probably ongoing reflection that I will have to undertake. And I think, and also invite other people working on this topic to also do the same. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We arrived to the end. I want to thank again all the institutions behind the promotion of this series of webinars. My feeling is that we have just started with this conversation on participatory authoritarianism, and it's much more to discuss. And then I find also highly productive to have this, like, it's not global, but to somehow from very different perspectives approaching the topic. My thanks again to Azucena for leading this initiative, and we remember everybody that there are 3 more webinars also in very challenging topics coming soon.